Now have a look at this chart, and this summarises what we've just said, but maybe in a slightly simpler way. At the top, we have a timeline consisting of the first, second, third, and fourth kingdom. And we see that when the first kingdom begins, a one world government is established. And shortly thereafter, or about that time, a man of sin arises, which in this case was Nimrod, a rebel against God. When the first kingdom ends, God's people are called out of Babylon, or Mesopotamia. This was Abraham who was called out, and he's called out about the time that the second kingdom is beginning. Now, the first kingdom isn't destroyed, its dominion is taken away, but it actually continues. Babel continued to function as a city. When the second kingdom overthrows it, it actually rules from Sumer. It sort of like takes it over. And the second kingdom rules for a while, and when it ends, there's an increase in knowledge, and when the second kingdom ends, the first kingdom is actually destroyed, together with the second kingdom. And this is a very important point. We'll come back to this. At this time, at the end of the second kingdom, the other thing that happens is that the fourth kingdom is founded. It doesn't rise to dominion, but it begins to exist as a nation. Now, during the third kingdom, the church is reorganized, as we've said, and then there's a falling away. And then at the end of the third kingdom, when the fourth kingdom begins, there's actually a change of government in the fourth kingdom, which is what enables it to become this dominating power. And in the case of Assyria, it was when Tiglath-Pileser became king, he actually reformed the entire government of Assyria. Before him, Assyria had been in civil war and hadn't been functioning very well. And so there's a change in the government of the fourth kingdom which enables it to come to power, and towards the end of the fourth kingdom it creates an image of the beast. In other words, it transforms itself into an image of the succeeding kingdom, which happened to be Babylon. And it did so by transferring its capital and adopting Babylonish religion. And at the end of the fourth kingdom, Israel is destroyed. Now, this timeline is very, very important. This timeline is a type of what was to happen. So let's look now at the antitype. What actually did happen? We know from Daniel's vision, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that he saw a great metal man. And it had a head of gold, and then it had, after him, another kingdom which was inferior, and then a third kingdom of brass, and then a fourth kingdom which is strong as iron. We read about that in Daniel 2, verses 38 to 40. And we know that that is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. But as we've just seen, the precursor to Babylon was Babel, and the precursor to Medo-Persia was Gutia and Elam, and the precursor to Greece was Egypt, and the precursor to Rome was Assyria. Now, if you hadn't noticed the parallels between these, we're going to go through them again. The first king was Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar actually magnified himself above God, and we know who did this because after having received the dream of the great metal man, he decided that that wasn't good enough and he was going to build his own version of it, which is an improvement above God. And then on another occasion he looked out and said, "Isn't this great Babylon that I have built?" When he full knew that it was God that had given them the kingdom, and so he was struck down for 7 years. Now, what Nebuchadnezzar did is that he created a new world order, because before him there'd been no universal kingdoms. They'd been regional powers, but they were fairly limited in what they could do. But Babylon actually created the first universal empire, and secular historians call this the Age of Empires, started by Nebuchadnezzar. And he subdued the world militarily, of course, just like Nimrod, and lo and behold, they spoke one common language. In fact, the book of Daniel is written both in Hebrew and Aramaic, and they both are very similar. They basically stem from the same common ancestor language. And so most of the world spoke one common language. Babylon continued the worship of the mother and child. And the mother, of course, is Ishtar, or Semiramis, and the child is Tammuz. And so that continued, and of course sun worship and moon worship was again re-established, because Babylon is where sun and moon worship originated from. Now, interestingly enough, Babylon took God's people captive for 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as a second Nimrod, and Babylon as a second Babel. Some years ago they found a tablet inscribed, again in cuneiform, and this tablet was a few thousand years old. It's actually written by Nebuchadnezzar himself, and the inscription reads like this: I have completed its magnificence with silver, gold, other metals, stone, enamelled bricks, fir and pine. The first, which is the house of the earth's base, the most ancient monument of Babylon, I built and finished it. A former king built it, they reckon 42 ages, but he did not complete its head. Since a remote time, people had abandoned it, without order expressing their words. Since that time the earthquake and thunder had dispersed the sun-dried clay. The bricks of the casing had been split, and the earth of the interior had been scattered in heaps. I did not change the site, nor did I take away its foundation. I set my hand to finish it and to exalt its head. As it had been in ancient days, so I exalted its summit. And that was translated by Mr. William Loftus in his books Travels and Researches in Chaldea and Sinai, page 29, London, published by James Nisbet, 1857. Nebuchadnezzar here is boasting of how he has restored Babel. After Babylon, a new kingdom arose, and we know that that kingdom was Medo-Persia. And we know that it came from the east. The Medes came up first, but the Persians were the stronger nation. Now, Medo-Persia didn't destroy Babylon. In fact, what they did is that they just evicted the Babylonian kings and preserved Babylon, actually set it up as a regional capital and preserved its culture. At this time, the Jews were called out of Babylon, back to the promised land. We need to recognize that the Gutians were the ancestors of the Medes, and the Elamites were the ancestors of the Persians. So the Gutians and Elamites were the Medes and the Persians. History is repeating. Now, after the Medes and the Persians, we know that Greece came up. And Greece came from the west. The empire of Greece eventually split into two warring parties, the king of the north and the king of the south. Or as historians call it, the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire in the north. Now, it's interesting that Babylon was actually not destroyed by the Medes and the Persians, but was destroyed by the Greeks. They completely destroyed Babylon, and it was never again rebuilt. The Greeks are known for their advanced scientific knowledge. In fact, the Greeks were on the verge of discovering the steam engine. We know this from the archaeological artifacts that had been found. They had clock towers in all of their cities that kept the time accurately. They had mechanical calculators with gears for accurately calculating the position of the sun and the moon and the stars for any day of the year. They had quite advanced scientific knowledge. And lastly, what we know about the Greeks is that Plato, writing about 600 BC, tells in his history about the famous lawgiver of Greece, a man named Solon, how he actually went to Egypt to learn wisdom from the Egyptians, and how in Egypt he was told that the Greek gods were actually borrowed from Egypt. So the Egyptian religion was changed a little bit, but essentially continued living on in Greece. And the Greeks had a funny sort of mix of atheism and pantheism all at once, a little bit like the Egyptians. And so, in many respects, the Greeks are the continuation of the Egyptians. And we know that this is the case because the centre of Greek or Hellenistic culture was actually based not in Greece, but in Alexandria in Egypt. And so Egypt was the base for the Greek culture. At the same time, during this third kingdom of Greece, there are some changes in God's church. Well, first of all, there's some reorganisation. Ezra reiterated the law. Now, some years after he had passed away, about the time when the Greek Empire was arising, Israel actually became an independent nation. And this was granted to it by Alexander the Great because of a dream he'd had. Now, it's about this time when they became an independent nation that they actually reorganised the government of Israel and set up the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling civil and religious power in the nation. So, under Greece, we have this reorganisation, the formation of the Sanhedrin, and Israel becoming independent, just like what happened at the time of Egypt under Moses. Now, again, about the middle of the Greek period, Israel began to prosper materially. And it actually was doing quite well for itself. And this prosperity again led to a falling away. And so towards the end of this period of the Third Kingdom, they started to adopt Hellenism. And Hellenism was all the philosophy of the Greeks. And this is why when Jesus came, they weren't quite sure about whether there was any resurrection or not. And many other things happened. So, for example, they built a gymnasium in the middle of Jerusalem so that they could have Olympic Games. Now, if you know anything about Olympic Games, first of all, you know that they're run in the honour of the pagan gods, and secondly, back then, all the athletes competed naked. And so the Jews, wanting to not appear blemished, because to the Greeks, any mutilation of the body is considered a blemish, were actually undergoing surgery to reverse the effects of circumcision. So we have this great Hellenistic apostasy in the church when Israel began to fall away from the ancient faith. So we have the same three changes in the church as took place under the Egyptian era. Now after Greece, the fourth kingdom arose, which was Rome. And we know that Rome, the fourth kingdom, was diverse from all the other kingdoms. And how was it diverse? Well, Rome was actually not a kingdom. It didn't actually have a king. Rome was a republic. And this is why it was diverse. All the other kingdoms had kings. Rome, we're told in Daniel, was to push to the south towards Egypt. It would push to the east towards Syria. It was proud and ruthless, very much like the Assyrians. They were well known for just arbitrarily just killing everybody they could find. In fact, if we look at the destruction of Jerusalem, 2 or 3 million Jews died, and every single other Jew that was found left alive was sold as a slave. And Israel was depopulated of Jews. Now again, just like we saw with Assyria, Rome was initially Judah's ally. In about 168 BC, Judah had sent ambassadors to Rome, asking Rome to protect it against the king of Syria. Just like had happened with Assyria. It was actually Ahab had asked the king of Assyria to protect it from the king of Damascus that was part of Syria. So, while being initially Judah's ally, Rome destroyed Jerusalem, just like Assyria had destroyed Israel. And Rome carried away the last 2 tribes of Israel, just like Assyria had carried away the first 10 tribes of Israel. Just like Assyria had relocated its capital to Babylon and made an image of the beast that was to come after it, Babylon, Rome relocated its capital to Constantinople to make way for the papacy, or the beast that was to come. So it also created an image of the beast.